So I think we're going to get started. We have quite a few panelists and I think a really timely and important topic. Welcome. My name is Meg Satterthwaite. I am one of the faculty co-directors of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and the faculty director of the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights here at NYU. And we'll be talking today about what we're calling human rights in an illiberal age. And I anticipate that we'll talk about both sides of that equation. I am going to give you just a couple introductory remarks, and then the way we will do this is to have each of the panelists open with a few minutes, and then we're going to try to encourage as much discussion among the panelists as possible, and then I promise to reserve time for real discussion with all of you as well. So today's forum is entitled Human Rights in an Illiberal Age. Before the election, we had actually planned for this forum to be about Philip Alston's extreme poverty mandate, and it was essentially going to be Philip and I talking about what is it like to be a special rapporteur, what are the priorities of the mandate. After the election, that felt really not like the way to go. It feels really important that we actually address some of these much more basic issues. We're really in a time when we have to be asking the tough questions about human rights, about its role in checking human rights violations, and what are some of the effective methods and what are least effective methods to do that. So one question then is, has the world of human rights itself been sort of turned upside down by the election? And I would say yes and no. For those of us whose work is global, the US election, characterized by rhetorical attacks on democratic institutions, the use of xenophobic and racist tropes, a call to enact anti-Muslim laws and policies, and a call to economic and cultural nationalism, was really only the latest and most close-to-home manifestation of a trend that we've seen globally. In many countries across the world over the past several years, we've really seen what has been called euphemistically a closing of space for civil society. That sanitized term is really a catch-all phrase that summarizes acts of governments in all regions, in countries like Turkey, India, Kenya, and China, to outlaw or restrict the functioning of non-governmental organizations, to imprison or sanction human rights lawyers, to silence the media, and to shut down foreign funding to civil society. In Europe, populist and nationalist leaders are on the rise, and of course Brexit is perhaps the most recent and most talked about here in the United States, but it's only one example of larger trends. If you look at what's been happening in Hungary and the Netherlands, and of course in France as well. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights noted in the fall, populists the world over have a common formula, and this is how he summarized it. Populists make people already nervous feel terrible, and then emphasize it's all because of a group lying within, foreign and menacing. Then make your target audience feel good by offering up what's a fantasy to them, but a horrendous injustice to others. Inflame and quench, repeat many times over until anxiety has been hardened into hatred. The formula, of course, includes not only rhetorical and discursive attacks on those seen as other to the dominant group and on the liberal values of equality, multiculturalism, and free speech. It also, once populists ascend to power, includes very concrete moves to dismantle or disrupt key democratic institutions of the state and society. So it is that our current president has begun to put his rhetoric into action, promulgating executive orders to implement a Muslim ban and bar refugees, build a wall along our border with Mexico, and bar funding to organizations abroad that even discuss abortion. Promises to bring back torture loom. Restrictions on LGBT rights are under discussion, and I think the question really is what form will they take? And the right to health of millions is gravely at stake. These measures come amid signals that they'll be followed by more straightforward withdrawals from and even attacks on international legal institutions. While the United States has always been exceptionalist, advancing global norms but resisting human rights-framed inquiry into endemic violations at home, the US has also always been a major funder and champion of human rights institutions at the regional and global level. Major cuts to U.S. funding for and participation in the UN and other bodies have been foreshadowed. A study has been initiated with a view to the U.S. withdrawing from various multinational treaties, including human rights and environmental conventions. Meanwhile, at home, the human rights challenges that have simmered in the background continue and threaten to fall off the radar as new crises emerged. Just this morning, Sean King reported in the Daily News that, quote, Trump's first month in office ended with at least 105 people killed by American police. That's the highest number of people killed by American police in any one month since 2015. But the once high-profile organizing of the Black Lives Matter movement is no longer center stage. As King points out, endemic human rights challenges like those stemming from racism, economic inequality, and disregard for the earth will only worsen without the focus on them. So what can human rights offer in this moment? Is human rights discourse and practice well suited for this new challenge? Or is it a practice and discourse whose time has passed? So this is what we're going to be posing as a question to our panelists, and let me briefly introduce them. So Philip Alston probably doesn't need an introduction at NYU, but he is the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law. He co-chairs the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and is its founder. He's taught at the European University Institute, Australian National University, Harvard, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. In 2014, he was appointed by the UN as the Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty. And from 2004 to 2010, he was Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, undertaking official missions to Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, the United States, DRC, Philippines, Israel, Lebanon, Albania. He's been on a number of commissions of inquiry, has served as special advisor to UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Millennium Development Goals, and as many of you know who've studied the Economic and Social Rights Covenant, was the rapporteur of the UN Committee between 1987 and 91. Bahar Azmi is the legal director over here of the Center for, I'm sorry, now comes the alumni part of the introductions. I realize that every single person except for Philip is an alumni, which is kind of cool. So Bahar is the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He directs all litigation and advocacy around issues related to the promotion of civil and human rights. At CCR, he's litigated cases related to discriminatory policing, the stop and frisk case, which many of you are quite familiar with, government surveillance, the rights of Guantanamo detainees, and accountability for victims of torture. He's currently on leave from his faculty position as a law professor at Seton Hall, where he taught constitutional law and directed the Civil Rights and Constitutional Litigation Clinic. While there, he represented Mernat Kurnaz, a German resident of Turkish descent who was imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay and then released. Thank you, Bahar. In addition, he litigated cases challenging police misconduct, violations of the rights of immigrants, prisoners, and the press. He was selected in 2012 as one of the top 500 lawyers in America. And he's a magna cum laude graduate of NYU, where he was a root. Ajim Dike, who I did not know was an alum, is an expert on human rights and the former executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, a national network of over 250 organizations working to build a human rights movement and culture in the United States. She's worked in the domestic human rights arena for more than a dozen years. Her work focuses on addressing poverty and discrimination using a human rights framework. She's led the largest civil society delegations and participation in international human rights reviews of the U.S. before UN human rights mechanisms in Geneva. Previously, she was director of the Human Rights Project at the Urban Justice Center, where she launched an annual report card on the human rights record of the New York City Council members and organized a New York City visit by UN Special Expert on Racism. She received her Master's of Urban Planning from Wagner at NYU. And finally, Maria McFarland Sanchez Moreno is co-director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch, where she guides Human Rights Watch's work on national security, immigration, and criminal justice in the U.S., including large-scale surveillance and drug policy. She also served the organization as Washington Deputy Director, where she conducted advocacy with the U.S. government on a wide variety of global human rights issues, including matters related to the Middle East and North Africa during the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring of 2011. Earlier, she held the position of Senior Americas Researcher, serving for over 5 years as the organization's primary expert on Colombia's internal armed conflict. She, before that, worked on sovereign litigation as an attorney at Cleary Gottlieb. She also was the Crowley Fellow at Fordham Law School, and she holds a magna cum laude JD from NYU. All of that was important, not only because you now know how august they are, but also just to demonstrate how varied human rights careers are, and to give you a sense of where the panelists are coming from. So now I'm going to open by asking this question. Is human rights an important and salient framework for responding to the current illiberal moment, or is it something whose time has passed?
Should I start? Okay. Thanks, Meg. It's always good to be on a panel with you and to be back at NYU. My sense is the international human rights norms are as important as ever norms around freedom of religion, freedom of travel, dignity, anti-discrimination, and especially important as domestic civil rights and constitutional norms are under attack. But obviously, there's a real threat in the way that we could operationalize those norms, because there are major threats to international mechanisms and international institutions, I think, that are coming from a few directions. First, concretely, you mentioned this, the sort of planned defunding of international institutions, UN programs, and the like, and even the destabilizing of security-based international arrangements like NATO shows how deep and this disruption may go. I think a second threat to these mechanisms is plainly ideological. I think America First says all one needs to hear, it leaves little to the imagination. I think based on ideology, we could expect rejection of treaty-based norms like the Convention Against Torture, as compared to the Bush administration, which, of course did legal maneuvering around it, but did not sort of, I don't think would have rejected it publicly in such a kind of, for lack of a better word, macho way. And obviously, rejects claims of disenfranchised individuals or countries on the basis of these neutral human rights norms, which may be cast as politically incorrect or weak or threatening America. And a third threat, and this is just a very quick catalog here, there's probably so many more, is given that this president is vacant and vacuous and has no core beliefs himself, the threat of capture, I think, is real. And I think of at least two areas of capture that threatens human rights. First, we talked a little bit about this, capture by the religious right, that could drive foreign policy in significant ways. The sort of Pence coalition that could subvert, family planning, alliance with right-wing governments abroad, there's a real marriage between the fundamentalist Christian right and Islamophobic movements here and abroad. See, for example, the exception for Christian refugees and that whole narrative of persecution in Islamic countries, which is nothing, but it is the only priority. The other area of capture is corporate capture. Of course, this Secretary of State, like this nightmare of waking up on a monopoly board, is a former CEO to Exxon, a massive multinational corporation, which rejects a lot of regulatory international norms and norms of corporate accountability, I think, which will be in so many areas around exploitation of natural resources, environmental justice, a real threat. Meg and I have been working on some of the sort of war on terrorism issues for a long time. So part of my point of departure is my time with the working on these issues during the Bush administration. And I think there are ways in which things are demonstrably worse and ways in which they may be a little bit better. So one way in which things may be worse then is, as I said before, I I think international pressure and international human rights norms were successfully brought to bear to some extent on the Bush administration, at least in the areas of Guantanamo, torture, and extraordinary rendition. There was a spirited fight about the applicability of those norms, but I think there were so many pressure points from international institutions and international actors, even at the kind of bilateral level, country to country, that had some pressure over the long term, and may have resulted even in changes in the administration from whoever it was the first time to Condoleezza Rice. Not that she's a paragon of human rights speak. And obviously, I think the attitude, as I mentioned before, to human rights from this administration will be worse. But there's, I think, a way in which maybe things could be better. I'm thinking here by analogy to what's happening domestically, because obviously domestic civil rights and constitutional norms are under attack. The political branches are useless, and the only institutional safeguard is the courts. But the courts weren't present very much, or as much as they should have been in the Bush administration. And we all know from constitutional law, it's the least dangerous branch, institutionally weak, but they're being so emboldened by mass popular movements that are validating rights claims in the way that they could otherwise easily be ignored through all sorts of judicial doctrines you all learn about in first and second year of law school. So what might that mean for human rights? Is there a way in which we can marry mass mobilization with a human rights discourse? And so a couple of areas that come to mind, and again, I don't know exactly how to operationalize this. Think about Standing Rock. And it feels to me like the domestic legal argumentation is not very rich. I mean, it's a property law dispute, but there are, or Flint, there are real potential conversations around international human rights norms that would, I think, embolden this popular movement, strengthen it, and we can be thinking about that. And there have been successful uses of international human rights norms at a local level that I think are worth thinking about. Also, maybe this immigration order is an opportunity to think a little bit more deeply or radically. I mean, there's all this talk about, of course, sovereignty and the plenary power doctrine, but I think sort of academics and activists can start thinking more deeply about how those doctrines came into play, the sort of early century xenophobia and American exceptionalism, and thinking about this not just as a kind of crisis of sovereignty and borders or an immigration crisis, but a broader global migration crisis, and thinking about the U.S. role in a lot of these international crises and developing a critique there. I sort of happen to note, so there's a correlation. I think 5 of the 7 countries on the list the U.S. has been involved in militarily. Something to think about, and then also sort of being somewhat defensive in this period, and with an eye towards preserving these institutions as much as we can and emerging in 4 years with something more positive to fight for.
Great, thank you. I think we'll go alphabetically, which means Asia, you are up.
Oh, wow, okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for those opening remarks, Meg, and for your comments for her, because you've touched on a number of things that I would have said. I have spent the last 15 years challenging U.S. exceptionalism. That is to say that all my human rights work, or the vast majority of it, has been focused on holding the U.S. government accountable to its human rights obligations and realizing human rights fully for people who live in the United States. And I say that because what a lot of what I've spent my years doing is fighting this notion that somehow human rights violations don't occur in the United States, which I know that we all don't agree with. But perhaps more relevant here is that somehow when human rights concerns, when we have human rights concerns in the United States, that they're different from the human rights concerns that they have in other places, like Iraq or Venezuela or Russia or wherever, which is all part of being exceptional, and that we somehow don't have a lot to learn from people who are outside the United States, be it from their laws or from their organizing or leadership. So that's what I mean when I've been fighting U.S. exceptionalism, and we see it in many different ways. The result of U.S. exceptionalism is, of course, that in the U.S., we don't really have a movement-building culture that has really understood human rights tenets and values. We haven't really spent the time and resources to learn about human rights in the way we could have if maybe the civil rights movement wasn't derailed or steered away from human rights back in the 40s and 50s. It also means that we don't have systems that respect, protect, or fulfill human rights, so that when we find ourselves with a president that is openly antagonistic to human rights, we're scrambling a bit. So when the question of whether human rights are relevant come up, and I hear it a lot, I've heard it from sometimes on some surprising quarters, I always am a little bewildered, right? We have in the US today about 500,000 people who are living on the streets or in an emergency shelter. Half of those people are families with children. We have about 13% of Native Americans, indigenous peoples, who don't have access to safe water, even as they approve the Dakota Access Pipeline. That's not to mention all the other communities that don't have access to clean drinking water. We have about 6.1 million people who are disenfranchised, who are barred from voting due to felony convictions. And quite frankly, if those people had been able to vote, we wouldn't have the president we have today in the United States. So yes, human rights are relevant. They are today, they were yesterday, they'll be tomorrow. So I think the question that we will be discussing really is, how do we as human rights advocates and human rights movement builders forge ahead with integrity, with commitment, and perhaps most importantly, with urgency? And that's what I'm hoping that we talk about today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Maria. Sure, so 16 years ago, I was a student here. I was a 3L, and I was working on my student note, which was about Peru, the country that I grew up in, and how its constitution had repeatedly failed because it had been changed pretty much every 10 years. It was utterly meaningless. What mattered was the president and what the president wanted. There were very weak courts. There were virtually no checks on executive power. I grew up under Fujimori. He is now in prison, and things changed over time. But it's interesting for me to think about that right now, because at the time, the US seemed like such a different place, not because it was exceptional or because it didn't violate human rights, because it clearly did and does, and has been hypocritical in its defense of human rights in so many ways. But because it did have institutions that seemed fairly stable. It had a constitution that had lasted for a very long time. There was a system of checks and balances that seemed to work. The courts were stronger. The press was stronger than in other countries that I knew. And even though I think I always knew it was vulnerable, because any country is vulnerable to populism and authoritarianism, it still came as a bit of a shock that we're in this moment right now, so suddenly. And I think it raises questions about how embedded those processes, those democratic principles, those understandings of rights and liberties really were in the country in the first place, or whether they've eroded over time. I think right now we have a real need for human rights discourse, not necessarily using the language of rights in every case, at least of human rights, because I think Americans often understand rights, but they understand it using different language. They understand it in terms of civil rights, civil liberties, and we need to find ways to talk to different audiences where they are. We need to find ways to reach them. It's clear that we in the coasts have long been talking about human rights, and we have people in the middle of the country who also do, but there are many, many others who don't get it, or who view it as somehow a fringe or far left discourse. We need to find ways to get people to think about rights as something that matter to them. And I think that's not going to be easy. There's a huge opportunity because we see a lot of protesters out. We see hunger for things people can do. We see energy, and we should try to work with that. We need to be humble about our ability to reach all these people who are already mobilizing around their issues and realizing, women's rights groups are realizing that immigration is also important and they need to unite around that, and that you need to reach out to American Muslims. So let's try to build on growing solidarity across past divisions, while at the same time recognizing that for many people, the ACLU is what they think of as the first defender of rights in the country, and because they think of constitutional liberties and rights, and they think of litigation as the way to do it. I think we need to find ways to talk to people about these issues in a way that they can understand. We need to educate them, and we need to work jointly across all our different divisions. Human Rights Watch does not do litigation like the ACLU, but we do deep investigations that we try to put out there, and we try to tell human stories about the people affected by problems. I think that's still relevant. I think it will be more and more relevant over time. And I think there's room for all sorts of different ways to contribute, for all sorts of different people and movements and groups to weigh in. But I think what's perhaps most urgent right now is for all of us to start talking to each other, which is why I was telling Meg and Philip that I'm taking every invitation that I get these days to talk to other groups, because I think that's where a lot of the action is going to be happening.
Great, thank you. Philip.
Thanks, Meg. I can't believe that with a name like Alston, I've been put to the back of the alphabetical queue. I'm going to change my name to Aaron Alston, I think. Several points, I guess. First, I am possibly even more pessimistic than others on the panel, in the sense that I think that we are going to see a gigantic paradigm shift, basically, across a whole range of areas. I think the basic normative framework of human rights is being destabilized. I think the great Russian achievement in rolling back their violence against women law this week is just one fairly salient illustration of that, but there'll be many others. It's not so long ago, Bahir was talking about the good old days of the Bush administration, when we thought that torture was the big exception. That was the norm that had been rolled back. But I think we're going to see a lot more norms fundamentally challenged and difficult to defend. I think the international institutions framework is going to suffer an enormous attack. The US has played an important role, both for good and for bad internationally, but when it's been on the good side, it has made all the difference in terms of the functioning of those institutions. If that's withdrawn along with its money, I think it's going to leave the field open to a lot of very negative forces. I think we're seeing the central role of the state about to be dismantled comprehensively. We're not talking about this yet, but every one of the nominees for cabinet positions is about privatization, whether it's of housing, whether it's of health, whether it's of basic welfare, everything is going to be privatized. The state will be infinitely weaker. That leads me then to think that we need to reflect on the role of the human rights community. I think the big risk, of course, is that we will be short-termist, because we absolutely need the human rights advocates to be able to respond to the Muslim ban, to the whatever ban, to the next and the next. And of course, once a terrorist attack happens in the US, which is highly likely, if we stir up enough hatred and antagonism, a terrorist attack is almost a logical outcome. That gives a carte blanche to the Maison Blanche. And that's going to really be a problem. But the challenge, I think, is for all of us, I suppose, particularly academics, but not only, to also try to take a longer-term view. What are we going to do when the international institutions are deeply weakened, when the norms are really called into question, and the US is leading the other side, the Erdogan wing, basically, that everything domestic is terrorism, and really dramatic changes are needed in order to respond to that. Two more points only. One, I hear what Maria says, and I think it's very important. Sally Merry, who is a wonderful colleague of ours here, has talked about the vernacularization of human rights, the need to change it, to turn it into language that the locals, wherever they are, understand. But I'm also beginning to wonder whether it's not time to get rid of this nonsense that we can't talk about international human rights law in the United States, because that's not what we Americans think about. We think about civil rights. Well, that was great when your Constitution was functioning. It looks now as though that's seriously at risk. And any other country in that situation, the last resort is to say, listen, there are international standards, and that's what you've got to take into account. And I think there's a big risk of us moving away and saying, oh, well, you know, Americans are different. They don't like to hear about this sort of stuff. We've been through that in Australia. Australia has a similar aversion in many ways, but it's only the international organisations, so often on asylums, seekers and various other things, that have been able to come in and say, we don't give a damn if Australian law is deficient in this area. What you're doing is wrong. It violates international standards. And I think we need to come back to a bit of that. The final thing, and this is a pet project of mine, and I apologise, is simply to say that the exclusion of social rights from the overall framework of human rights, which has been a reality, whatever people say, various leading NGOs will say, no, we're doing a bit of work here and there. It's absolutely marginal. And I think if you look at economic insecurity as one of the major drivers of the disillusionment, and I think it is, we've systematically made more insecure the middle classes. Their access to jobs, the sort of wages they get, the prospects they have been undermined systematically over the last 40 years or so. And I think it's time then to take up the social rights dimension and to see how that can appeal to a much broader constituency and reintroduce balance into the human rights equation.
Thanks very much.
Okay. I would like to hear if you all, right now, because I think I've heard good, we need human rights discourse, we need human rights organizing, we need it as, to feed movements, and Philip, I think you're saying bring back the norms. Is that sufficient, though? I mean, if you think about right after the election, the big meme was ACLU's, I'll see you in court. We don't have the same meme, right? What is our meme? I'll analyze you in human rights terms. So it seems very weak right now. Can any of you kind of come to the defense of what the human rights movement might bring? Or maybe it's not the human rights movement, maybe it's the norms. Like, what's the teeth here? Where are the teeth?
The leader of the unfree world.
So I can jump in on that. I think one of the difficulties that groups that have done advocacy like ours face is that in the past, policymakers, at least at some level, were more or less receptive to what we were saying. And right now we're facing an executive that seems to totally reject the starting place, and a Congress that is almost in the same place. So we don't go to the courts, we don't go to the executive, unlikely we're getting anywhere in Congress. Where do we go? And that's why I think human rights discourse is important, because I think the place to go is the public. And the public is critical in shifting Congress to the extent that it can be shifted, in emboldening the courts, in holding the line for the press, because in some ways we're not even talking about winning here. We're talking about keeping things from getting even worse. So it's about maintaining the health of the society. If there is a terrorist attack, keeping the common understandings of the importance of rights from eroding further.
Yeah.
So there's.
And can I just ask you a follow-up? Does that mean HRW uses its same sort of traditional method? Like it's going to be fact-finding and a report? And let me just ask you on that a follow-up. What about this post-fact world? That's the bulwark of the human rights method, right? Is we're going to bring facts to life and we're going to tell people's story and then people will take action.
Yeah,
Does that need to change or?
What we've always done is document the consequences of policies that violate human rights and tell the human stories and bring them out to the public. We may not be able to influence policymakers in the same way, and we have a real challenge because of the fragmentation of the media and the fact that the public, that a lot of people in the public won't ever get our message because it's not covered by Fox News or by Breitbart or Red State or others. So how do we get through to that? I think it's a tough question. We're exploring, very practically, we're exploring 10 states where we think there might be some wedge issues that we might be able to engage with the public on, even though they have senators who might not be receptive to our points of view, but where the public might actually care because, for example, they legalized marijuana and they won't want Sessions coming in going after their state. So maybe there are things we can work with there in the middle of the country. Maybe we can help shape public opinion that way. But it's all requiring a lot of creativity. It's going to require investment of resources in tools that we didn't have before, and greater outreach at the regional and local level, among other steps.
So I think, I don't have a fancy meme, but I think our focus should be on building power. That's what has successfully brought any change in the United States. In fact, legal strategies have never been able to work on their own unless we're able to have people in the streets, where people were able to get communities organized. So I would say we build power, we disrupt their spaces, we make them uncomfortable. If I think about, when I grew up in Nigeria at a time of a lot of political upheaval, and when I first came to the States, I was surprised by what we called protests. Because when I tried to organize my first one, I was told we had to get a permit and be given permission, and we were told where to march and where we couldn't march, which was, I guess, a parade or a march. I don't know what you would call it, but it wasn't a protest in the way that I understood it. So what's been exciting over the last few years has been to see that change and to see, I mean, we saw it with Take Back the Land, we saw it with the Occupy movement, and of course we saw it with the movement for Black Lives, right? So, and saw young people engaged in a way that they hadn't been in my college years. So I think focusing, and then we've seen it in reaction to this presidency. So what I would say is that if we are interested in actually changing things, we have to think about, on a long term, how we sustain our ability to build power in communities to make them uncomfortable. We're not going to get it by having meetings with elected officials, you know, or I think in my experience, in fact, whenever we've met, even with the Obama administration, when they've been moved the most is when they were threatened by embarrassment of people on the street. So I feel like that's where the human rights movement should be going. And for a long time, the human rights movement has been somewhat divorced from movement building. So we talk about, those of us who talk about human rights talk about it in terms of using international mechanisms, human rights advocacy, investigation, maybe some legal strategies, but we don't really talk about building power at the community level. And I think that that's where we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you, Jim, and I also don't know much about memes, and I don't know if I would have enough characters to add to the ACLU ones, but I think a more accurate meme would be, I'll see you in court and on the streets, because anyone who wants to put their entire faith in the judicial system, given the menace of the threat and the limitations that we can spend a lot of time talking about that courts have in promoting social change, should not be resting at night. So so just 100% agree with Ejim. We need to think about supporting the power of social and political movements, which are have been in place for the past decade. If you think about the movement for Black Lives among Dreamers and the immigrants' rights movements, which is really being emboldened at the grassroots level, married with this sort of broader mass mobilization. And so, so I think, you know, what that might mean is a kind of short-term defensive strategy of resistance the resistance in the courts and disruption in the streets that slows the administration down and just preserves as much as we can of our institutions, and at the same time thinking a little bit more radically about how to empower movements with a human rights discourse, sort of going to the limitations on a rights analysis to begin with. We can just start asking people, like, what is it? What are human needs? Water, land, sustenance, and how can we think big about? I mean, I think about give the right credit. They have an amazing constitutional imagination. They constitutionalize every issue. What? An individual right to bear arms. What? Dismantle one person, one vote. If the dynamics of the election had been reversed, there have been 40 court cases in a half hour with plausible, like once bonkers theories that would suddenly become plausible, like the challenge to Obamacare. Could we imagine, develop the same aggressive imagination around human rights discourse over time and really be assertive about it at the same time we're trying to stop the worst from happening?
Two very quick comments. One, I think that the United States is a proud country, and I think international shaming is going to be very important, saying this is a disgrace, this is not what we stand for. I think it's going to be interesting to even see China, which is sort of aghast at much of what's happening. The second comment may not be very helpful, but I agree with everything that's been said, but I really worry that it's a very short-term defensive solution And if you look at what the right is all about, the right has persuaded people that the state is evil, that taxation is bad, and is now persuading people in authoritarian directions. The question is, can the human rights movement then push back against that by saying, no, just slow down, hang on, not so much. We object. Where's the vision? And I think that human rights has always been a visionary thing. There's got to be something that you imagine, something that you're aiming for, something that people want. And that, again, brings me back to the economic and social rights dimension of a renewed focus on human rights. But there's got to be a vision which is alternative to that that's being presented rather than just a defensive posture.
No, I wanted to piggyback off of that because I think that's a great point. I read a survey recently that basically suggested that on basic human rights issues, the majority of Americans actually agree with us. I think the question has just been the failure of the so-called Progressive Party, the Democratic Party, to convince people that it is the party that would actually protect those things. And something that Baher said reminded me of also something else the right has done very well, which is organizing. Once Obama got elected, they went straight to work, organizing in the long term, right? So it's, yes, I think part of this administration's strategy is actually to distract us, have us running helter-skelter. Every day we're talking about a new thing, something substantive, some things very trivial, right? But all it does is it depletes us. In the meantime, we're not organizing long-term. So I agree that that's what I was trying to speak to when I said that we need to think about movement building long-term, and we need to connect it to electoral politics. We need to think about replicating the Tea Party. We need to start organizing in communities and convincing people that, in fact, that we have a party, a political party, that will end up protecting those rights and force that political party to protect those rights. So I feel like it's basic, back to basics 101 organizing that we have to think about over the next 2 years. And in my mind, that's a short term.
Coffee party.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
I think
please.
one thing we need to grapple with is that at least some of the voters who went for Trump were rejecting what they perceived as corruption. And I think we have to recognize that the problems of influence peddling and penetration of state institutions affect the entire system, not just one party. And therefore, it means that we need to find ways to talk about those issues as well, which don't always fit comfortably into a human rights framework, but we need to talk about them in ways that can reach some of those people who feel disenfranchised. And that goes beyond economic and social rights, too. To reach people who feel like they've been left behind, who should care about rights, because they actually are vulnerable. And I think that the messaging to do that is very, very tricky to get right. But we need to have a movement that is able to cross some lines, not just build on all the people who are already out on the streets, which is great, and we should do so, but we need to find ways to broaden it.
So I'm hearing a number of sort of strands around norms. Obviously, norms is being really helpful in movement building, but also, Baher, you're saying sort of starting with what people need and then recognizing those are rights and articulating that way. Philip, you're talking about the importance of economic and social rights. Jim, I think you gave a number of examples that point in that direction too. But then we're also talking about the paucity of the norms as they relate to some of the phenomena that we're looking at. The capture of the government, I think, is particularly important here, and the privatization of any number of basic services that we anticipate may happen. What is therefore the role of lawyers in this? Talking to a bunch of law students and lawyers, how does that need to change? Is it also about a new kind of norm building, a new kind of norm articulation? And also, if you prefer, is there also a remaining role for the formal institutions of human rights? Or are we really talking get out in the streets and use the discourse? Any of those?
I think there are a variety of roles for lawyers. I think one role our organization sees ourselves playing is challenging power and building power, challenging state power in ways where it's exploitative and dangerous and hurts communities, and then building power, the good kind of power, the kind that Ejim talked about, power of social movements. And I think the both fronts are really important, and sort of the way in which lawyers can think about supporting the organizing that's happening through litigation and advocacy. So, you know, what are lawyers doing to get ready for the assault on activists and worker centers and NGOs, and so, you know, how can lawyers support the organizing that's going on to free them up to do the political work that they need to do? And to my mind, that's going to be really critically important, particularly since I think a lot of the things like privatization are not amenable to domestic, and as far as I can see, international human rights litigation type norms. It's just got to be resistance. And so, you know, how can we support activists that are taking on the dismantling of public institutions by putting their bodies on the line? How do you provide criminal defense, First Amendment defense, that sort of thing, and really discipline ourselves to focus on that legal effort while others are doing some big cases.
I agree with what Meher said. I don't know if this is a role as much as it would be a practice, I think, for lawyers, and something I've been thinking about a lot. And that is that our movements and all of our strategies, legal strategies included, have to be led by the people who are most directly impacted. I mentioned earlier how, sometimes you see human rights advocacy somewhat seemingly divorced from the people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations. And I think that's because the people who have been at the forefront of the human rights movement and advocacy have been probably the most privileged. And I don't just mean identity privilege, by the way. I also mean the fact that we have educations. We've gone to college. We can command a certain salary. We're accepted in certain circles. So that is privilege that also protects many of us when it comes to suffering some of the worst human rights violations too often. Or often, maybe not too often. So I would say that if lawyers could start to think about how they might actively practice stepping aside, ceding power to the people who are most directly impacted, that it would really make your strategies the most effective. When we've used, and so I wanted to pick up on something else Phil said about economic, social, and culture, well, social rights, but I'm adding economic rights to that and cultural rights. At the U.S. Human Rights Network, one thing we're very proud of is the fact that we were dedicated to building a movement that was led by the most directly impacted. What that meant was that when the U.S. government was being reviewed at the United Nations, we made sure that the people representing issues, violations in the United States were the people most directly impacted, were people who had lost their children to police violence, people who were formerly homeless or undocumented, people who had no access to clean water. They were speaking for themselves. They were often the people with the most expertise on the issue. They were definitely the most persuasive speakers. there are also the people who understand that there's no time to waste. You often hear people tell you to slow down or to wait, or, this will take time. That those people who are telling you to do that are the people who are not directly impacted. When you're directly impacted, you don't have time to waste. You can't wait till tomorrow. You need everything now or yesterday. And I think that's what I meant when I was talking about urgency. That's the kind of urgency we need in our movement, and that's why that in whatever we do, we should cede space to those people. That's why we were able to talk about economic and social rights, because as part of the network, people understand human rights, by the way. It's not Americans, like that discourse, we talk a lot about how we don't understand human rights in the US, and I say it a lot too. Yet, at the network and previously at the Urban Justice Center, we got calls every day from regular folk who were just calling because they knew their human rights had been violated. So they understood that. They just, maybe what they didn't understand was that we didn't have laws to actually protect them or that they could use to realize their rights.
Okay, I would really like to open it up now because we've got about 15 minutes left, and we'd really like to get some discussion going. I see Ignacio's hand in the back. Please use the microphone, by the way, because we are recording it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. I think you've all kind of touched on this, but there's a whole question of how do you turn all this energy into political power. And one thing the Trump campaign did very well is they had one very sort of simple slogan, "Make America Great Again," and they had a hat that fit with the slogan, and it conjured up an image of kind of a glorified American white supremacy of the 1950s, and something to that effect. And my question for all of you is, what's our slogan and what's our hat, so to speak? So and I think Professor Alston touched about this. Like, what are the narratives, or what is the messaging that our movement needs to be based around?
Okay, let's take 2 or 3 questions just so we have a couple in the queue. Ignacio, you still have your hand up?
Hi, Ignacio Saiz from the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Thank you so much for this magnificent panel. I'm relieved that none of you felt that the human rights framework is irrelevant in this context. This discussion echoes many discussions that we've been having within the broader advocacy community at a global level, not just here in the US. And I think for all our differences, there's a very strong feeling that human rights is critically important in this time for 3 reasons. Human rights as a set of norms. So a set of norms that outline what the role of the state is and what the obligations of government are, which is so critically important as the whole role of the state is being whittled down, as Philip said. Secondly, as a language for decrying injustice and for mobilizing against injustice. And thirdly, as a strategy, as a set of norms, as a set of mechanisms, as a set of concrete pathways for holding government accountable. And I think it's across those 3 fronts of norms, discourse, and strategy that we need to think about how those can be revitalized in a way that institutions are not eroded, that language is meaningful, and that norms are strengthened and reinforced where there are gaps. And I really want to thank Philip for stressing the need for a holistic approach to human rights across all these 3 fronts. Not just for the reasons that he said. I mean, clearly, economic disparity, social deprivation is a factor that has fueled the rise of populist politics, not just here in the US, but the rise, the Brexit referendum and so many other manifestations of populism around the globe. But also we need to critique, as a human rights movement, the economic and social rights implications of the Trump administration's policies, from the repeal of the Affordable Care Act to the impact of the reduction of corporate tax rates, financial deregulation. And these are things which will have a huge impact on people's rights and livelihoods and on economic inequality here in the US and globally. I mean, the reduction of corporate tax rates is already prompting a global race to the bottom. I mean, all governments are going to say, oh, well, if the US is going to only impose a 15% corporate tax rate, then surely, why should we have a higher one? So I think the human rights movement's response will only be credible and effective if it is holistic and if it does take into account the economic and social dimensions of the rise of Trump and his like, and also of the implications of these policies. And many of us within the advocacy community are trying to do so through analysis, but also through mobilization and through using the institutions that we still have at the national and international level to hold this administration accountable.
Great. And the question is, do we agree? Okay, one more question.
Hi, well, thank you so much for your comments. My question is about international shaming proposed by Professor Alston. I was wondering, considering the role that the U.S. has played and the terrorist groups and antagonistic governments, how can it be done in a way that these governments and terrorist groups won't use it to feed their ideology and to do more terrorist attacks and going after anti-Western ideas? How can it? Yeah.
Okay. So let's just go down, and you can sort of take whichever you would like to take.
I can take the one about the hat.
Great.
I don't think we need a hat, and I think the thing about the hat is, and not to make too much about the hat, is that it's not ultimately sustainable, even on its own terms. I mean, I think through a perfect storm, he was able to get in power, but I think he won't make America great by any measure. And I think what we can expect is, and what we've been talking about, is a steady dismantling of institutions and structures so that he can remain in power. So it's not going to be the hat that's doing the work. It's going to be the sort of power wielded to suppress votes, privatize public institutions, et cetera. I think the Republican Party knows they're a minority party and are thinking very strategically about how to cement their entitlement to power going forward. Not to go so dark, but I think that's the reality. And some, I mean, even Yes We Can is a lovely slogan, but I think it was clearly married with a massive organizing strategy. So just to, again, repeat what, as I've been doing every time I've opened my mouth, to repeat what Ejim said, organizing at the local, and just a friendly amendment, I think is implied, at the local level, because I think the left fetishizes the presidency while the right is taking over state houses and building power so that they can win more broadly. So organizing over the next 4 years with a clever meme here or there.
I mean, I sadly think that slogans are going to be important. Women's rights are human rights was pretty important way back. I don't know what it is. That's the problem, but I do, and I don't think it's any substitute for what Bahir describes in terms of serious organizing and policies and so on, but slogans matter. In terms, just of Dalaram's point, the sort of shaming that I have in mind obviously is not the Ayatollah in this morning's newspaper taking it up and saying, you see, Trump really is exposing what America's always been about. And I think a lot of the groups, ISIS and others, will probably be also capitalizing. But I think the Speaker of the British House of Commons saying there's no way that Trump's going to come and address this Parliament. I think once that is broadened out to the whole of the Western world, people saying, we don't want this guy, he doesn't stand for our values, that starts to hurt.
And just to piggyback on that, I think it's critical that Americans make clear that this person and the things that he's saying do not represent who they are. That is the best way to distance yourself, but of course they're going to build on it, and you can't stop that. So, economic and social rights, absolutely, I agree with everything that you said. The one little caveat I would make is that I think what it was the average Trump supporter actually made something like $70,000 a year. They're not the poorest people. the weakest, poorest people in society did not go for him, and the ones most affected by economic and social rights violations did not go for him. And it's very important to keep that in mind as we think about who is affected by rights violations and who we're trying to reach.
Can I jump in very quickly and renounce my mandate as Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and say that it really is a mistake to see social rights just as for the poor?
Oh, absolutely.
But
I
I
agree
think
with
you
that.
can appeal to the middle class and say that economic insecurity is a social rights issue.
Totally agree with that.
Right.
So, quick thing, just to piggyback on what Bahir said earlier around local elections or organizing. I heard just a couple days ago that the Democrats need to win. And this is my disclaimer. I'm one of those Democrats that's always threatened to go independent, right? So I'm not, I'm not endorsing the Democratic Party wholesale here, but given the two parties, I know where I stand. But that the Democratic Party needs to win, 24 seats to win back Congress in 2 years, and that there are 23 congressional districts that actually voted Democratic locally, but then voted for Trump. So that there's a disconnect in so many places where people actually agree with a lot of the principles that the Democratic Party supports, but somehow were captured by Trump. And what is that thing? And this is what I wanted to speak to, because I think it actually touches on the economic argument too. There's this sense, and it is true that people were tired of or suspicious of how corrupt the political system is, and that people are worried about their economic futures. I think that the only reason that the Trump administration was able to capitalize on those fears was really exploiting racism and the idea of white supremacy. And I think that until we address that, there's been a tendency in the progressive movement to sideline race as a reason for why this election turned the way it did. But here's why I think it's about race. The Tea Party and the alt-right Republicans really started organizing in earnest after Obama was elected. A lot of people claimed, and they were able to convince people that they did not like Obamacare because it was connected to Obama. But guess what? People didn't know what Obamacare was. Now that they're finding out what Obamacare really is and what they stand to lose if it's repealed, they've changed their minds. So I think that the way in which Americans have been able to be convinced that somehow people like Trump would protect their economic interests is by exploiting the fear that this country is really changing. Make America great again? When was America great? No one ever asked him that question, because who was it great for? But it has this tinge of racism underneath that people, a majority of white Americans, feel like at some point that the country they knew is changing, and that it's changing in ways that will cause them to lose power. That's real. I think that that's something that we have to start talking about honestly if we are going to build long-term solidarity.
Great. So we're almost out of time. I want to give everyone just one more chance in case you have anything you feel like you wanted to say that you didn't get to say. Anyone? No? Okay.
Once again, I'm going to second what Agent said.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, panelists. I think you gave us some extremely concrete advice about what we need to do as lawyers, as movement lawyers, as organizers, as defenders of human rights defenders. I think we're talking about human rights defenders here, and a lot of food for thought around what we need to be talking about. I just want to quickly also put out a plug for the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. We will be really committing ourselves to working on these issues. It's very, very important to us. And we invite NYU students and the whole community to join us in this effort. We do have a student scholars program. Come check it out on our website, or come talk to any of us after. Thank you.
Thank you.